Today on BRStv Investigates, all the time reefers debate whether stratification and the consistency of a salt mix from the top to the bottom of a salt bucket is a problem, so we tested 11 different salts to find out if that's real. Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we put popular reefing gear, theories, and methods to the test by experimenting on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And in today's experiment, we're mixing batches of salt water from the tops and bottoms of 11 different salt mixes and testing them with ICP OES laboratory tests in order to further explore the idea that dry ingredients in our salt mixes will separate or stratify into different layers inside the bucket or bag as it travels from the manufacturer to your doorstep. When all is said and done today, we'll get some solid insight into whether hand mixing the dry salt mix ingredients or using larger buckets or bag of salt has any downsides, and if they do, could there be alternative choices out there that better fit our needs? Let's find out when we answer two questions today of, will salt mix stratify or separate before we get the chance to use it in our saltwater tanks? And if it does, should we be concerned about it? So after being mixed in the manufacturer's warehouse and then being shipped by boat, plane, train, or truck to the distributor, and then being shipped again from the distributor to your front door, do you think that the different materials that make up a dry salt mix, components like salt itself, sodium, calcium, magnesium, carbonate or bicarbonate, other minor and trace elements, would separate into different layers inside the salt bucket or bag based on particle size or weight, and from the exposure to a variety of vibration and shifting movement? Meaning that by the time you open your new bucket of salt mix to mix up a batch for your water change, have the salt mix materials separated in a way that would cause different parameters between that first batch of mixed salt water to the last batch, and also in a way that we should be concerned about. Today, we plan to find out. Here's how we approached this one. We opened brand new, fresh off the shelf buckets of Aquaforce Reef Salt, Brightwell Neomarine, ESV B Ionic, HW Reefer, Instant Ocean Standard and Reef Crystals, Red Sea Coral Pro and Blue Bucket, Two Little Fishies Accuracy 1, and Tropic Marin's Classic and Pro Reef Salt. We weighed out each salt to the gram to mix up 4 gallons of salt water from the top of each bag or bucket, and then 4 gallons from the bottom of the bucket to a commonly targeted salinity of 1.026 specific gravity, then let them mix until fully homogeneous and set out Triton ICP OES test for each one. Since there is no direct test for alkalinity in the ICP test results, we also used a HANA alkalinity checker to take a DKH reading for each one after they were fully mixed. Okay, so I have to note here that because there's a ton of data with 37 element results for 22 different tests, we won't put you to sleep by going over each individual result. Instead, we'll share any results that we find that are different from the top of the bucket to the bottom, where there's a difference of 5 to 10%, 10 to 20%, and over 20%. For those results that are 5% or less, we'll consider them homogeneously mixed and not a concern. So with that, let's find out how the results played out by first looking at 3 major foundational elements that most reefers are concerned about from a consistency standpoint throughout the salt mix bucket, with calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium. After that, we'll circle back for a wider review of all 37 elements that were tested. Today we're going in alphabetical order, which means Aquaforce Reef Salt is up first, with calcium testing coming in at 467 for the top and 457 for the bottom, which makes for a difference of 2.14%. Alkalinity tested at 8 and 7.6 DKH from the top to the bottom for a 5% difference, and magnesium ended with a 0.19% difference, with 1575 parts per million on the top and 1572 on the bottom. I'd say that from a major element standpoint and alkalinity being right on the cusp of what I'd consider completely homogeneously mixed, there doesn't look to be much of a difference from the top to the bottom in this specific bucket. Up next is a bucket of Brightwell Neomarine, where we see a 3 part per million difference calcium level between 388 and 391 for only a 0.77% difference, yet alkalinity at 8.8 and 8.0 DKH and magnesium at 1627 and 1480, both close to a 9% difference from top to bottom and not completely homogeneous. It's ESVB Ionic's turn next, which is the only salt mix today that doesn't combine all the ingredients together into a homogeneous, dry mixture, but instead comes with 4 different components that are mixed together individually, which inherently defends against possible stratification since you're adding pure sodium chloride, then magnesium sulfate, then pre-mixed liquid components for alkalinity and calcium, both with minor and trace elements. As the data from this mixing approach shows, where we scoop the top and bottom of both dry components, then added in the respective liquids of calcium and alkalinity, all 3 levels ended up with less than a % difference from each other, with 0.68 for calcium, 0 difference for alkalinity, and 0.3% difference for magnesium. This one will definitely be interesting later to see if all 37 elements wind up with similar results. Going to a box of HW Reefer for our next test, we find a 0 difference in calcium from top to bottom. Alkalinity had a 1.1 DKH swing for a 9.89% difference, and magnesium was pretty darn close at a 0.59% gap between 1508 at the top and 1517 on the bottom. Again, this looks to be another salt that falls below our threshold for a major concern of fluctuating levels throughout the mix. For Instant Ocean Standard, we see a 2.05% calcium difference from 430 to 440 and a 0.2 DKH or 1.94% difference in alkalinity. However, magnesium is the outlier in this bucket of salt, where with the top at 1580 and the bottom at 1411, there's a total difference of 10.7%, which for me rides on that edge of whether or not there would be some benefit to further mixing at home or at the manufacturer. As for Instant Ocean Reef crystals, we find a top calcium level of 572 and a bottom at 468, which winds up being 18.18% dissimilar from each other. Alkalinity shows similar results at almost 2 DKH between the top and the bottom, with 9.4 to 11.1 or 15.32%. Magnesium also winds up with over a 10% gap, coming in at 12.48%. This is the first bucket of salt we see today where we'd likely expect to see a significant benefit of mixing the dry salt at home before use, or probably more mixing from the factory for a more even blend of the components. It's difficult to know for sure if the stratification happened during transport or from the manufacturer. We have a bucket of Red Sea Coral Pro next that shows a 1 part per million calcium difference between 450 on top and 449 on the bottom, for a total of 0.22% separation. Alkalinity ends with a 4% difference from 9.6 to 10.0 DKH, and magnesium within 3 parts per million from 1442 to 1445 for a 0.21% variance. Being under our 5% threshold on all fronts, it looks like this bucket we chose is good to go. Red Sea Blue Bucket is next, and again, these are very consistent numbers from the top to the bottom, with 1.34%, 1.19%, and 1.62% for calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium respectively. In this example, just an even blend all around. Moving on to Two Little Fishies Accuracy 1, this salt mix is unique in that they separated the box into small, individual bags to make them easier to make small batches while preserving the remaining salt in the entire box, which means we mixed a bag from the top of the package and a bag from the bottom of the box for our test. The calcium for the top bag came in at 449 parts per million, while the bottom bag was 424 for a 5.57% difference. The alkalinity between the two batches was closer together, with 8.7 and 8.9 DKH, or just 2.25% apart. The magnesium was 6.98% different, with 1504 on top and 1399 on the bottom. All in all, this one turned out seemingly close to the edge of being fully homogeneous. Because we used 100% of the pouch, these inconsistencies imply that further mixing at the factory could be of some benefit. Tropic Marin Classic is up next, with a calcium level on top testing at 418 and on the bottom at 374, which landed it at a 10.53% variance. The alkalinity was 1.7 DKH apart from 9.7 to 8.0, or 17.53%, with the magnesium being somewhat equally dissimilar at 12.36%. With the numbers from this batch, it would seem that it could use a bit more mixing before use. Next, we have a bucket of Tropic Marin Pro, which showed some of the best numbers so far for calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium, where we see no difference at all from the top to bottom in calcium nor in alkalinity, and just a 0.28% gap for magnesium from the 1418 top to the 1414 bottom. From the looks of it, this example of a Tropic Marin Pro shows to be a very homogeneous mixture, even after many weeks of international travel from Europe to the US and across the distribution chains. Okay, so after what we saw here from the ICP results for calcium and magnesium, coupled with a Hanna checker for alkalinity, is that 2 out of the 11 salts tested in a way where I would strongly consider mixing the dry salt mix prior to use, and a few that were borderline. However, at face value, it looks as though stratification is likely less of a concern than I would have previously thought. But let's see if the data presented across all 37 elements tested tells the same tale, because trace elements come in smaller quantities in the bucket, which theoretically could make them easier to settle or stratify out into higher or lower concentration pockets. Looking at all 37 elements tested, across the board we see that Aquaforest Reef Salt shows only 4 elements at or over the 5% line, with the difference in manganese being slightly higher than the rest at 18.18%. Still, I would consider this particular bucket of salt to be nearly fully homogeneous from the top to the bottom, with results like these. Moving on to Brightwell's Neomarine, we see 10 out of 37 elements showing above a 5% difference between top and bottom of the bucket. All but 3 of those 10 are between 5 to 10%, with manganese being right on the verge at 10.42%, and nickel and aluminum as outliers of over a 30% difference. To me, this particular batch is still not fully homogeneous. Much as we would have expected from ESV Bionic's approach to mixing 4 individual components to create saltwater, the results we saw for the major 3 elements were pretty solid from top to bottom. When we take a step back and look at all 37 elements, we see somewhat of a similar tale, with only 3 out of the 37 elements being more than 5% apart. Although 2 are above 10% and 1 is above 30%, I'd consider this one to be one of the more homogeneously mixed salts from today's testing. For our box of HW Reefer, we find that 9 out of the 37 elements to be over 5%, with 5 cresting over 10% and 3 over 20%. When we looked at the major elements for calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium, this sample of HW was just under our threshold for likely needing a bit more mixing. However, now that we've added a few more elements to the mix, I'd go ahead and say that there's probably some added benefit to mixing the dry salt mix before use. Instant Ocean Standard is next, with 8 elements coming in at above 5%, only 4 of those tested above 10%, and 1 which was above 20%, which lines up with our previous assessment of this particular example, riding right on the edge of slight concern for further mixing and likely benefiting from a bit more mixing. As for the Instant Ocean Reef crystals, which we determined from the major elements could likely use some more mixing, we find that 16 out of 37 elements tested fell above the 5% difference from top to bottom. Of those 16, 14 of them were above 10% disparity and 5 were over a 30%. There's no doubt that in this instance, the bucket we used here could be more homogeneously mixed prior to use. Red Sea Coral Pro tested pretty well in the first round, where we determined that this sample was close to fully homogenized by all 3 major elements, testing lower than 5% variance from the top to the bottom, and it looks pretty similar in the full panel of 37 elements, with a total of 4 coming in at above 5% and 2 being above 20%. As for the Red Sea Blue bucket, there were 6 elements over 5%, with 3 of them landing above 20% dissimilar from the top to the bottom. I'd place this salt bucket in the same category of riding the edge for being a little bit of a concern to possibly needing some more mixing before use. Two Little Fishy's accuracy showed some promising results in the major elements, with calcium and magnesium just slightly above a 5% difference from the top 5-gallon bag to the bottom 5-gallon bag. However, when we look at all 37 elements as a whole, we see a different picture, where 12 of the 37 come back as more than 5% dissimilar. 6 of those 12, or half, tested greater than 10% apart, and 3 were over 20. This is a unique situation where, because the bags of salt are individual and most reefers will make an entire 5-gallon batch like we did, there's really not an opportunity for us to blend this box of salt better at home without defeating the purpose of a single-use packaging. In the first test for Tropic Marin Classic, we determined that it could use some further blending before use, and as we look at the data for all 37 elements side by side, the story looks to be about the same, where 18 of the 37 elements are more than 5% apart from the top to the bottom of the bucket. Of those, 16 of them are above 10%, and 4 elements rise above a 30% variance between the two batches we mixed, and certainly could have performed better. Tropic Marin Pro is up next, and from the nearly perfect results from having zero difference between the top and the bottom of the bucket for calcium and alkalinity, and a 0.28% difference for magnesium, we find that out of 37 elements, 5 of them showed dissimilar results from the top batch to the bottom, where 3 of those tested above 10% and 2 above 20%. For a salt with performance like this, I don't think it's worth the time and effort of considering further mixing. Okay, so we asked 2 questions at the beginning of the experiment, and let's see if we came up with any answers after the results we saw here. First, will salt mix stratify or separate before we get a chance to use it in our tanks? Well, out of the 11 salts we tested here today from the major 3 elements that most reefers are concerned about, we said that 2 of them could benefit from further mixing and 3 were riding the fence. From the full 37 element panel, we determined that 3 salts could be mixed a bit more, while 4 were somewhat of a wobbler. So with that, I'd have to rate this one a 4 out of 10 on the Reef Fantasy scale. While I know reefers are always in pursuit of perfection, for a majority of the salts represented here, it just looks as though they meet a reasonable standard for a homogeneous salt mix blend, while others seem that they could benefit from additional mixing at the factory or before use in our home. Again, I wouldn't necessarily assign today's results to a specific brand because it likely varies from bucket to bucket, but more so across the majority of the 11 salt mix examples, stratification just wasn't an issue. As for the question of if this is a major concern for the average reefer, I'd say that in almost every case, we will eventually use the entire bucket from top to bottom, and over time these differences will simply balance themselves out. Even if one of the elements were 30% different from top to bottom, if you calculated that out using a 10% water change, that really only results in a 3% marginal change in the tank, which is both meaningless and nearly impossible to test for accurately. A couple of instances where I see these differences having slightly more significance is for those who do larger water changes of 25 to 50% or more, where the impact is greater, or those with small tanks where pockets of inconsistencies may create spikes in the tank. In these cases, I think best practice would be to take the time and effort to either mix the dry bucket or bag of salt thoroughly before use, or better yet, find a manufacturer that offers smaller sizes of salt mixes like Tropic Marin, Red Sea, or Aquaforest. Either that or use an approach that will inherently reduce the chances of a spike or pocket like ESVB Ionic, where the components are separated and you rely on your consistency in making the same batch of salt water time after time. Again, the results we saw here today are not a specific indication that one brand is doing this better than the other, and we might find slightly different results if we ran this test on other buckets of the same salt brands. If you're interested in seeing the complete 22 ICP OES test results for all of the data we covered here today, you can find them in the link in the description or the article link pinned in the comments below. For those that do want to review them and take notice of the results against Triton's recommended set points, just note that those set points are simply a guiding tool specifically for the Triton method and not necessarily an absolute that these are the perfect levels. And for those results that you may find with large variances between the top and the bottom of their respective buckets will likely be balanced out if the entire bag or bucket was mixed as a whole, so just be mindful of how you review and utilize the data. We've been asked numerous times to test and share the ICP OES testing data throughout all of our various salt testing experiments, so clicking on those links to this video's article will finally get you an inside look and is definitely worth checking out. We've done a bunch of videos on salt and salt mixes that you can find on this link to them over on the site. One in particular you should keep your eye out for are the answers to the question, how much do these salt mixes actually cost us per month?